The kitchens of Aldermere House smelled of rendered tallow and rosemary, and on the morning of the 23rd of November in the year 1815, a young woman stood at the great scrubbed table with flour to her elbows and a borrowed apron tied twice around her waist, because the apron had belonged to a woman twice her width. And she was not that woman, and had not been for some time now. Her name was Cecily Fairwood. She was 23 years old. 6 months ago, she had been Miss Fairwood of Fairwood Grange. With a father living and a household to manage and a small but dignified place in the order of things. She had kept accounts, received callers, administered remedies to the tenants, and managed a house of moderate size with a quiet competence that no one had ever thought to remark on, because quiet competence in a daughter is taken as a natural feature of the furniture. 3 months ago, her father had died of a fever contracted on a journey he had not needed to take, and the Grange had passed by entail to a cousin she had met exactly twice, and she had arrived at Aldermere House not as a guest, but as a kitchen assistant, because the housekeeper, Mrs. Farrell, was her father's old housekeeper's sister, and it was the only door that had been left standing. She did not think of herself as proud. She thought of herself as practical. She wore the apron because the kitchen required an apron. She mixed the pastry because the kitchen required pastry. She learned to bank a range and scald cream and produce a clear broth that Mrs. Farrell pronounced adequate, which from Mrs. Farrell was equivalent to a minor commendation. She did not speak of the Grange, did not speak of her father, and did not speak of the ring. The ring was the reason she was here. It was her mother's ring. Her mother had died when Cecily was 9, and the ring had been on her mother's hand at the end, a narrow gold band set with a single garnet, and her father had kept it on his own smallest finger for 14 years, and when the cousin had arrived to take possession of the Grange, he had removed it from her father's effects with the calm of a man collecting debts. His name was Mr. Aldous Fenwick, and he had taken the ring because the ring was, technically, now his. It had belonged to her father. Her father had belonged to the entail, and so, Fenwick reasoned, did everything within the house. The garnet was not large, the gold was not heavy. It would not command attention at any auction. Cecily's mother had worn it on the day she married, and Cecily had watched it catch the winter light through a sick-room window when she was small enough to believe that light through a window was something a ring could keep. And it was not a thing that could be replaced by any logic Fenwick might offer. What Cecily did not know on this particular morning was that Aldermere House belonged to William Deverell, the Earl of Aldermere, and that the Earl of Aldermere and Aldous Fenwick were connected by a business matter involving 3 parcels of land in Yorkshire that the Earl had not yet concluded. She knew only that Fenwick had been invited to stay for the hunting season. She knew only that the ring would be somewhere among his effects, in a coat pocket or a traveling case, and that he would be here for 3 weeks. And that 3 weeks was time enough. She did not yet know what the Earl looked like. She learned within the hour. He came into the kitchen at 7:30, which no gentleman of his rank should have done, and he came because he had received word that the kitchen's coal supply was insufficient, and he wished to speak with Mrs. Farrell directly, rather than route the complaint through a footman. Cecily was at the range when she heard the door. She turned with a query already forming, because Mrs. Farrell had gone to the larder, and she was the nearest person, and she found herself looking up at a man who stood 6 feet, and perhaps 1 inch more, with dark hair worn close, and a jaw that had not yet entirely forgiven the morning. He wore riding clothes, not formal dress, and he was regarding her with an expression that she could not immediately name. It was not surprise, exactly. It was the expression of a man who notices something and decides, in the same instant, to keep the noticing private. "I am looking for Mrs. Farrell," he said. "She is in the larder, my lord," Cecily said, because she had been briefed on the peerage titles of the household, and she was not unprepared. "I can fetch her, or take a message if it would serve." He looked at her for a moment longer than the exchange required. His eyes were a particular shade of gray, the kind that changes its quality according to the light, and in the kitchen's morning dimness they were almost silver. He said, "You are new." "3 days, my lord." "What is your name?" "Cecily," she said. She did not offer the surname. There was no reason a kitchen assistant should offer a surname to an earl. He nodded, once, as though filing the information in a place he intended to return to. "Tell Mrs. Farrell I need to speak with her about the coal delivery," he said, "when it is convenient." He left the word convenient sitting in the room like a small, unexpected gift, because earls did not often say convenient to kitchen staff. They said at once, or immediately, or they said nothing at all, and simply expected. He was gone before Cecily thought to register what had just happened. She turned back to the range. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. She considered this a small personal victory, and pressed the back of one floury wrist against her cheek, which was warmer than the range's warmth accounted for, and returned to her pastry. Aldermere House was not a small establishment. The Earl employed 36 indoor staff and a considerable outdoor contingent across the estate's 4,000 acres of Wiltshire countryside. He was 34 years old, a widower of 5 years, and the county had spent the better part of those 5 years assuring itself that he would remarry before the next season's end. He had not. He managed his estates with a precision that his steward found somewhat alarming, attended to his seat in the Lords with a diligence that his peers found somewhat inconvenient, and spent his evenings in a library whose breadth the county had no occasion to remark, because he did not invite the county into it. He was, the county had decided, an eminently satisfactory landlord and a thoroughly unsatisfactory bachelor, and it meant the same thing. His late wife had been a woman of considerable beauty and no particular warmth, and she had died in circumstances that were technically an accident and were in no other sense simple. She had taken a fall from a horse on ground she had been cautioned not to ride, and he had been in London when it happened, and he had arrived home to a house that had already begun to grieve around a version of events he could not confirm or contest. The fall was clear. The narrative that had settled over it within a fortnight, brisk and tidy and sealed against examination, was less clear. He had a portrait of her in the gallery that he passed daily and had not looked at directly in 3 years. He had learned to look slightly past it, at the plaster cornice beyond, which required no particular management. He did not speak of this to anyone, too. He managed it as he managed everything, precisely, and from a sufficient distance. Cecily spent the first week learning the kitchen's rhythms and Fenwick's habits simultaneously, because both were equally important. She learned that the kitchen operated on a schedule that Mrs. Farrell defended with the severity of a general, and that if the first service was late, the second service became a crisis, and the third service became a reckoning. She learned to time the baking to the range's particular disposition, which ran hot on the right side and uncertain on the left, and to adjust accordingly. She learned that the scullery maid, a girl called Polly, could be relied upon to scrub, but not to stack, and that the kitchen boy, Tom, had the makings of a cook if anyone could be bothered to show him the difference between browning and burning. She learned also that Fenwick breakfasted late, that he preferred the first cut of anything and complained when he received the second, and that he kept his traveling case locked with a small brass padlock whose key he wore on a chain at his watch fob. She had not expected the padlock. She adjusted her expectations accordingly and continued to observe. She had not intended to be seen by the Earl again. He seemed to have other ideas, or at least the house did, arranging coincidences with an impartiality that could not be blamed on anyone in particular. On the fourth day, she was sent to the library with a tray of tea things, because the footman assigned to it had taken ill, and she knocked and entered and found the Earl reading at his desk, with the late morning light falling across his hands and a small stack of papers at his right elbow, and the expression of a man who had been deep inside a thought and had surfaced only because the door had opened. He looked up and said, without surprise, "Cecily." She set the tray down on the side table. She straightened the cups with the automatic precision of a woman accustomed to making small things right. She was crossing to the door when he said, "Do you know what this is?" And she turned to find him holding up a small, leather-bound volume. She recognized it at once, because she had spent a portion of her childhood with a similar edition on her knee, sitting beside her father in the Grange's modest library while he read aloud, and she followed the lines with one finger. "Cowper," she said. "The task." He set it down. He looked at her for the second time with that expression she had not yet managed to name. "It is Cowper," he confirmed. "Are you fond of it?" "My father was," she said. "I came to it through him." He read The Garden aloud every August and said the heat made it appropriate. A silence followed. It was not an empty one. It had the quality of a room that has been entered carefully, so as not to disturb what was already in it. "Leave the tray," he said. "Thank you." She left. In the corridor, she walked 6 paces before she allowed herself to notice that her heart was doing something she had not instructed it to do, something that involved a quickening and a warmth she had no practical use for, and which she resolved firmly to manage. She managed a great many things. This would be manageable. She was not entirely certain she believed that. If you have ever felt the particular pull of a library and a gray-eyed man who says your name as though he has been meaning to for longer than he should have, then you know exactly what Cecily was managing in that corridor. If you have not, perhaps stay with her a moment longer. She has not yet found the ring. She began to speak with him properly on the 5th day. He asked her about the Cowper, specifically about the 4th book, and whether she preferred the domestic passages or the philosophical. And she answered honestly because she had found that dishonesty in libraries is a particular kind of waste. She said she preferred the domestic passages. A description of a tea kettle singing was more honest, she thought, than a meditation on Providence, because the tea kettle was always where you left it. He said that was a very precise observation. She said she had been spending a good deal of time with precise observations lately. He said he had noticed. The exchange lasted 13 minutes. She returned to the kitchen 17 minutes later than she should have, and Mrs. Farrell looked at her in the way of a woman who has formed a view but elected not to share it, and said only that the second service of the evening dinner wanted an additional hand. Cecily went. Fenwick was at dinner that evening, his cousin beside him, and 2 gentlemen of the county whose names she learned from the seating plan. She moved through the service as she was learning to move, efficiently and with her face composed into the pleasant blankness that the room required of people whose presence it did not wish to acknowledge. She watched Fenwick at his ease at the Earl's table and felt the specific cold weight of a woman who has something she needs to reclaim from a man who does not know she is watching. Fenwick said, toward the dessert remove, addressing the table generally, but the Earl in particular, "I understand you have taken on additional kitchen staff lately, Aldermere. A new face or 2. The Earl said, "I have. My housekeeper is thorough in her selections." "I only ask," Fenwick said, reaching for his glass, "because I believe I may have some passing acquaintance with one of them. A young woman of a certain quality. Rather out of place in a kitchen, if I am blunt. A fair wood, I think, from the county." The Earl said, I trust my staff to be in the places that suit them, Fenwick. He said it pleasantly, in the tone of a man making a statement that has nothing whatever to do with pleasantness. Fenwick smiled, entirely untroubled. Sad business, the father. Died without provision. Very little left in the end. One must manage these things practically, and the estate fell to me by good legal right. He set his glass down. Of course, I made what arrangements I could. One does. He lifted his fork. He did not look back. He had no reason to imagine that anyone in the room had a particular interest in the subject, because to Fenwick the subject was settled, and settled subjects did not require further management. Cecily stood 3 feet behind his left shoulder and looked, with great precision, at the wall opposite. She looked up once, across the table, and found the Earl looking at her. His face was quite still. His eyes were silver gray in the candlelight, and something behind them was not still at all. He held her gaze for 3 counted seconds, even and deliberate. And then he turned back to his dinner, and she returned to the service, and the evening concluded without incident. She did not sleep well that night. She lay on the narrow bed in the room she shared with a parlor maid who snored gently and thought about padlocks and ring entries in household journals and the way an earl could hold a gaze across a dinner table when no one was watching except the person he was looking at. The matter of the ring required refinement. She had observed that Fenwick, at his morning toilet, removed the watch chain and its attached key to wash and replaced it before dressing, and that in the interval the chain sat on the washstand in the room she was assigned to service on alternate mornings. She had observed this twice. On the 3rd morning she would be in that room, and she required only a few minutes, and she had a plan that asked nothing of her but composure and speed. She was resolute. She was practical. She was the daughter of a man who had written down in plain, careful script that the ring was hers. On the morning before she intended to service Fenwick's room, she encountered the Earl in the stable yard. She had been sent to carry a message to the head groom, and the message was not urgent, but the route was, because the kitchen's morning was tight, and Mrs. Farrell had been specific. The Earl was examining the foreleg of a gray horse that had been pulled from the morning's ride, crouched beside it with the ease of a man who has done this many times and trusts his own judgment about what he finds. He did not hear her until she was within 10 feet. He straightened. He was not quite out of breath from crouching, but there was a particular quality to the air around him. The outdoors and cold, and something that was simply himself. He said, "Cecily." He said it without the surprise that should have attended finding a kitchen assistant in the yard at that hour. "I have a message for Thompson, my lord," she said, holding up the folded note. "I will see that he has it." He held out his hand. She gave him the note. He put it in his coat pocket without reading it, and said, without preamble, "Fenwick leaves Thursday." She looked at him. She said nothing. "I have concluded my business with him regarding the Yorkshire parcels," he said. "There is no further occasion to extend the visit." A pause. "The hunting has been poor," she said. "I see. Do you?" He studied her face with the particular attention she was beginning to recognize as his, thorough without performance, and somewhat inconvenient. He said, "Fairwood Grange is entailed. Nothing can be done about that. I imagine you know it." She had not told him her surname. She was certain she had not told him. The ground shifted slightly beneath her, the way it shifts when someone shows you that they have been paying attention to something you thought invisible. "He told you," she said. "He told the county," the Earl said. "He told it at a dinner at Sefton's in October as an example of the entail working correctly. He thought it an amusing case." A quiet that was not quite a pause. "I did not." The yard was cold. The gray horse moved once, restlessly, and the Earl placed a hand on its neck without looking at it, a gesture so practiced it had become reflex, and the horse stilled. He said, "My solicitor handles estate matters and questions of inheritance. He is thorough, and he has a considerable command of the distinction between household inventory and personal property." She waited. She was trying to understand what was being offered and from what angle. "The ring," he said in a lower register. "Fenwick catalogued your father's effects. The ring is listed on his inventory. If it was your mother's personal property, if it predated the entail by 15 or more years, a solicitor's letter is not an accusation. It is a question of documentation." "My father kept a household journal," she said. Each word was careful. "It was sent with his personal effects. I do not know if he ever wrote about the ring." "What I know," he said, "is that Fenwick has arranged for a trunk of his belongings to precede him to London on Wednesday. If the journal were in that trunk, and if it contained a relevant entry, that would be useful to establish before Wednesday evening." She looked at him. He had constructed this very carefully, and said it in the plain English of a man who has decided against implication. He was telling her where to look and when. He was telling her that he knew why she was here, and that he had no objection to why she was here. She said, "Thank you, my lord." He nodded. He turned back to the horse. She walked to the house with a different configuration in her chest than the one she had carried into the yard. She was not certain she had entirely distinguished herself during that conversation. She was not certain she minded. She found the household journal on Tuesday afternoon, and it was simple and not simple simultaneously. The trunk was in the corridor outside Fenwick's room while the footmen were summoned to carry it downstairs, and in the interval, Cecily crossed the corridor on the pretext of delivering fresh towels to the adjacent room and looked at the trunk and made a decision that was the most practical decision she had ever made. It was unlocked because the footman needed to verify the contents, and she opened it on the pretext of checking whether a case of wine within was correctly sealed, which was not a pretext she would have offered if challenged, but which she was not called upon to offer, because the corridor was briefly empty. She found the journal in the third layer, wedged between two coats she recognized by their cut, and the small patch at the left cuff that Mrs. Carver at the Grange had repaired in the spring. Her father's coats. She put her hand on them for a moment, just a moment, and did not allow herself more than that. She opened the journal. She found the entry on the 14th of March, 1808, written in her father's careful, slightly slanted hand. "Her mother's garnet ring, returned to my keeping on Eleanor's death, as per Eleanor's own instruction that it passed to Cecily on the occasion of her marriage or her 25th year. The ring is and has always been Eleanor's personal property, and is not a household item or part of the estate's inventory." She read it twice. She closed the journal. She replaced it between the coats, in the precise position she had found it. She closed the trunk. Her father had known. He had written it down. He had intended for her to have it. And he had made a record of the intention, and the record was sitting in Fenwick's trunk in Fenwick's borrowed corridor in a house that did not belong to Fenwick at all. She went directly to Mrs. Farrell, who looked at her face and said nothing, and from Mrs. Farrell she went, by a route that required 3 minutes and steadiness of nerve, to the Earl's study. She knocked. She entered. She stood before his desk and held out a piece of paper on which she had written, from memory, the precise wording of the journal entry, because she had a precise memory, which was one of the things she had possessed for 23 years without having been asked to demonstrate it. He read the paper. He set it down. He looked up at her and said, "March, 1808. My mother died in January of that year, she said. He would have written it within weeks of her death. When he was thinking about the future. He was always thinking about the future. This is enough, he said. He said it with a finality she recognized. A solicitor's letter to Fenwick this afternoon, citing the specific entry and its date. The ring predates the entail. Fenwick's inventory was error, not fraud, and a polite correction is all that is required. He will resist because it costs him something he considers already his. Resistance to a documented claim by a solicitor in good standing is a tedious business, and Fenwick is not, in my experience, a man who enjoys tedium. She stood very still. She said, "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might decline. Men of his kind managed their motives as carefully as their estates. He said, "Because Fenwick described your father's effects at a dinner table as though cataloging surplus furniture, and he described it as an anecdote, and I have had no patience since October for the sound of a man's life reduced to a lesson about the efficiency of law." He paused. "And because you read Cowper, and you preferred the tea kettle, and I have been looking, for 5 years, for someone who prefers the tea kettle." She did not know what to do with that. She suspected he had not expected her to do anything particular with it, only to hold it and let it settle. She said, "I am still in your kitchen." "You are," he agreed. A silence that was not silence. The fire. The winter light through the study window. The sound of the house going on around them. She said, "I have been practicing at not noticing things." "I have observed that," he said. "I have been practicing the same discipline for some years. I have found it increasingly unsatisfactory." She looked at him. He was at his desk, still with her father's words in front of him and the gray light across his hands, and she understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who has learned to see the shape of things from the practice of not seeing them, that she had not been invisible to him at any point. She understood that he had gone to some trouble to ensure she was not invisible to anyone, including herself. She said, "I think Mrs. Farrell will wonder where I am." "Then I will not keep you," he said. He said it with the slight quality of a man who is elected, for now, to keep his own counsel. He held her gaze a moment past the words, the way he had held it across the dinner table. She left. In the corridor she walked 4 paces and stopped with one hand against the wall and drew one slow breath, and then another, because it seemed advisable. And then she went back to the kitchen, where the afternoon service wanted her hands. Christmas arrived in the house with the particular quality of a Wiltshire country Christmas, with boughs of holly in the hall, the smell of oranges and cloves from the kitchen, candles in the upper windows, and a sharp cold that the fires managed only approximately. The staff were given a small holiday, and Cecily used hers to write 2 letters she had been meaning to write since November, and to sit by the kitchen fire with a cup of tea, and permit herself, for the first time in 3 months, to want something she was not certain she was entitled to want. The ring arrived 11 days before Christmas, delivered to Aldermere House by a solicitor's clerk in a sealed envelope addressed to Miss Cecily Fairwood in the formal hand of a man of business. Mrs. Farrell brought it to the kitchen herself, which told Cecily everything she needed to know about how much Mrs. Farrell had known and for how long. The envelope contained the ring and a single line in legal script confirming that the item had been identified as personal property excluded from the estate inventory, and that the matter required no further correspondence. Cecily held the ring for a long moment beside the kitchen's afternoon fire. The garnet was very small, the gold was very plain. It was exactly as she had last seen it, in the Grange's front hall in September, on Fenwick's inventory list in a column headed Miscellaneous Effects. She put it on her smallest finger, her left hand, where her mother had worn it, where her father had worn it, and it fit. She did not cry. She had told herself she was practical, and she was, but she stood very still for nearly 2 minutes and let the firelight move across the garnet the way she had watched it move when she was 9 years old. The Earl passed through the kitchen at 3:15 that afternoon, which he never did, which she understood was not an accident. He paused beside the long table where she was working on the preparations for the evening, and she looked up, and he looked at her hand, and she saw the precise moment he saw the ring. He said nothing for a moment. His face did the thing she had observed it doing sometimes, in the library, when he encountered something he had not anticipated. It let something through briefly, before the discipline restored itself. She said, "Thank you." He said, "It was yours," as though the simplicity of the fact made everything else beside the point. That was all, in the kitchen. It was not all that was said before Christmas. He asked her, on the 20th of December, whether she had given thought to what came after. He asked her in the library, where she had been sent with the afternoon tray for the 4th time in a fortnight, and where she was no longer surprised to find the fire built high, and the chair on the near side of the hearth, vacant in a way that was beginning to feel intentional. He asked her, as a man asks a question that is also a declaration in disguise, and she heard both the question and what it was disguising, because she was a woman who had been practicing, for some time now, at listening to things that were said obliquely, having herself said a great many things obliquely, in the interest of not being too visible. She said, "I have not known exactly what to give thought to." He said, "I have been thinking about several things." He paused. "Specifically, for several weeks." She waited. The fire crackled. The house was quiet around them. He was standing 3 feet from her. He crossed one of those feet, and then a second, and he was close enough that she was aware of the cold he had brought in from his afternoon ride, still faintly in his coat, and beneath it, something that was simply him, wool and book leather, and the faint mineral quality of the Wiltshire air. He said, "Cecily." He said it the way he had said it in the stable yard, as though the name itself was a statement he had been holding. She said, "My lord." He said, "William, in this room." Very quietly, as though the room deserved the confidence. She said, "William?" He lifted one hand and placed it against her jaw, his thumb at the edge of her cheekbone, with a lightness so deliberate it was barely contact, and was the most significant contact she had experienced in rooms full of significant things. She felt the warmth of it through her whole chest, the way warmth travels when it finds somewhere that has been cold. He said, "I have been practicing discipline for 5 years. I have become very competent at it." She said, "And?" He said, "I have reached the point at which competence becomes its own kind of refusal." She did not step back. She did not step forward. She stood in the exact place where she was, and let the moment be what it was, which was the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of libraries and stable yards and dinner tables, and the ring and cowper and the tea kettle, and she thought with the clearest part of her mind that she was not certain she wished to reclaim the distance she had been practicing. He lowered his hand. He stepped back, precisely, like a man honoring a form. He said, "I would like to speak to you properly. I am asking only whether you will consent to hear it." She said, "I will." The speaking took place 2 evenings later, in the library again, because the library had become the room where true things were said. He offered what he had to offer, which was Aldermere and its 4,000 acres, and his name, and his particular gray gaze, and the history of a man who had been careful for 5 years, because careful was the only thing he had known how to be. He offered it without decoration, the way he said everything, in plain declarative sentences that left no ambiguity about what was meant. She received it with the gravity of a woman who understands that what is being offered is costly, because freely offered things always are, and she gave back what she had to give, which was herself and her precise memory and her preference for tea kettles and the knowledge that she would never manage his household in a borrowed apron if she could manage it in her own right. She said yes before he had finished asking. He put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her face with the expression she had finally named, the one she called recognition. The look of a man who has found a thing he had stopped expecting to find. She looked back at him with what she hoped was an equivalent clarity, though she was also warm behind the ears and not entirely in command of the precise nature of her composure. He said, "Cecily." She said, "I know." That was the library. The fire burned, the books stood. There was no one else in the room. If you would like to leave a word in the comments, this is a story that improves in company. Stay a moment, if you will. The engagement was announced on the 1st of January, and the county received it with the enthusiasm of a community that had been expecting something, even if not precisely this, and was relieved to have the suspense resolved before it became tiresome. Lady Hartwell, the former Dowager Countess who maintained a residence on the estate's eastern flank, and who had been corresponding since October with the family of a Miss Stanton Reeve of Northumberland, received the news at 10:30 on New Year's morning, and sat with it in her sitting room for a considerable interval before she was ready to speak. She called on the Earl the following day. She said in the drawing room, her fan at precisely the angle that indicated a sentence was being assembled with care. "I confess I was not aware the attachment had formed." "Nor was I," he said, "entirely, until it had." "She has been in the kitchen," Lady Hartwell said. She said it in the tone of a woman stating a fact that is meant to accomplish something. "She has been assisting Mrs. Farrell's second service, yes," he said. "She is also the daughter of the late Mr. Henry Fairwood of Fairwood Grange, who was a magistrate for 12 years and a man of considerable learning. She reads Cowper and prefers the domestic passages for reasons she can articulate precisely. I have found her company more worth having than most company I have been offered." "The county will remark on it," Lady Hartwell said. Her voice was composed, but a slightly shorter sentence than she might have intended. "The county remarks on everything," he said. "I have been its subject for 5 years and have not found its remarks materially accurate." She looked at him. He looked at her. She was a woman who had spent 30 years being confident in rooms on behalf of the Aldermere family. He was a man who had spent 34 years developing his own variety of the same quality, and it was not quite the same as hers. "Miss Fairwood," Lady Hartwell said after a moment, in the tone of a woman who has decided to file the matter and return to it when she has more information, "is not what I had anticipated." "No," he agreed. "She is not what I anticipated either." Lady Hartwell departed. She did not attend the betrothal dinner. She sent a note in the careful language of a woman who has lost the field, but intends to conduct herself well about it. And Cecily read the note and understood it without requiring a translation, and set it aside with respect for the craft that had produced it. The betrothal dinner was on the 12th of January, managed by Mrs. Farrell with the satisfaction of a woman watching a piece of work reach its completion, and Cecily sat at the Earl's right hand in a gown that had been her mother's, altered to fit her, cream silk with a narrow satin border, worn with the particular dignity of a thing that knows its own age and does not apologize for it. She wore her mother's ring on her right hand. She wore it on her left. The evening he placed a second ring beside it. He had had the band made quietly, giving no explanation to the jeweler beyond the measurements, and it fit exactly, which she chose to read as intentional. They were married in the Aldermere Chapel on the 28th of March, in the early spring, with the county present and the light coming through the old stone windows at the particular English angle that promises and occasionally delivers. And afterwards the county agreed that the bride was handsome in a manner that would improve with time, which was the county's highest compliment, and that the Earl looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he had been traveling toward for longer than he had admitted. The library became her library as well as his, by his insistence, by her gratitude, and by the natural logic of two people who both required books to think clearly. She had her volumes shelved beside his, a growing section that the housekeeper noted would require a second shelf before spring was finished. She read to him sometimes, in the evenings, and he listened with his face turned toward the fire, and the expression that was recognition, the one she had named and kept. On an evening in April, the fire banked against the last of the Wiltshire chill. She sat at the writing desk that was now also hers, and found, among the day's correspondence, a brief note from the solicitor confirming that all matters pertaining to the late Henry Fairwood's estate had been reviewed and found in order, and that the garnet ring had been formally confirmed as personal property predating the entail, and that no further correspondence on the subject was required. She set the note down. Beside her on the desk sat her father's household journal. The Earl's solicitor had recovered it in its entirety as part of the correspondence with Fenwick, and it had been returned to Cecily in the envelope with the ring, and she kept it on the right-hand corner of the desk, where she could see it daily. She had not read beyond the March entry. She had not needed to. She put her hand flat against the journal's cover. The garnet ring caught the firelight, small and plain and exactly where it had always belonged. The Earl came in from the last of his estate correspondence, crossed to the chair nearest the hearth, and settled into it as a man settles into a place that has become genuinely his, not by document, but by habit and by preference. He did not speak immediately. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the fire spoke for them for a moment. She said, "The solicitor has closed the matter," he said. "Good." A pause in which she heard the fire and the April wind against the stone. "And how does it feel?" She considered it with the care it deserved. She looked at the journal. She looked at the ring. She looked at the fire, which was the color of garnets. She said, "Like a room that has been kept shut for a long time, and opened at last, and found to be larger than one remembered." He was quiet. He reached across the small space between their chairs and laid his hand over hers, the same light and deliberate pressure as the first time, as though she were something he intended to hold well. She turned her hand and held his. The ring was on her finger. Her father's words were on the desk. The books were on the shelves. Outside the window, the Aldermere grounds were moving into spring with the tentative and hopeful quality of English springs, green arriving carefully, not yet certain it had permission. Inside, the fire burned. The library held them. She was home. Thank you for staying with this one until the end. If Cecily's story moved you, leave a word below. These stories are better for the company they keep.